Hello everyone, I would like to welcome you all to EAB 3794. This is a course that will be covering the principles of applied behavior analysis, and it is the second course within the ABA track at FIU. If you're unfamiliar with what the ABA track at FIU is, I will go over it briefly in the next slide and I'll provide some resources for you all. I just want to mention that if you are enrolled in this course, you should have already taken the prerequisite course EAB 3002, which is on the Introduction to the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. This course, along with the other courses in the ABA track, will be building upon those different concepts that you learned in EAB 3002. Therefore, it's very important that you've retained the terminology and the information that you've learned across that course. EAB 3002, along with all other courses in the ABA track, including this one, are all based off of the 6th edition BC-ABA test content outline. You may already be familiar with what the test content outline is, and some of you may not know exactly what that is. Now that you're enrolled in the second course in the sequence, I think it's very important to have a good understanding of what the test content outline is and why it's important or relevant within your courses, and why you should make sure that you are reviewing the test content outline and self-assessing, areas of strengths and weaknesses in case you're preparing for the BC-ABA exam. So I'll give you some information on that as well. So as I mentioned, this course is part of the ABA track at FIU. So to provide some more context, the FIU ABA track is a series of 7 courses that is going to prepare you for the BC-ABA exam. And really, I shouldn't say prepare you. We are providing you the necessary coursework to be able to sit or to be eligible for the BC-ABA exam. But really, there are other requirements that you must meet as well, such as supervisory experience, in order to be eligible to sit for the exam. The coursework is just one part of that necessary eligibility requirements for the certification. So the first link just gives you general information about the ABA track at FIU. And then the second link here that's provided, it provides an advising sheet for the 6th edition courses. It's very important that you're looking at the 6th edition ABA advising sheet rather than the 5th edition, because these courses are based off of the 6th edition test content outline, whereas previously we had ABA courses that were based off of the 5th edition task list. And so those are two very different course tracks. And so it's important that you're always looking for the 6th edition ABA advising sheet. Now, this link that I've included here was the most up-to-date version at the time that I've recorded this lecture. But it may not be the most up-to-date version when you are viewing the lecture. And so I want to make sure that you're always consulting with your advisor for the most up-to-date information, or that you are looking up these resources through the psychology website to get the most up-to-date version of this resource. I do like this ABA advising sheet though, because it includes a recommended course schedule, and I think it's important for you to be able to see within how many terms you can expect, or semesters you can expect, to complete the ABA track. If you are planning to sit for the board certified assistant behavior analyst exam, you must complete the track. But also I recommend completing the track if you are interested in pursuing a master's degree in behavior analysis. It will make you a more appealing applicant for the master's program. So you've heard me say this term BC-ABA a few times. This is the second course in the sequence, so you likely have heard the term BC-ABA several times, but I don't want to assume that everybody knows what a BC-ABA is. So a BC-ABA is a board certified assistant behavior analyst. This is the acronym that we use within our field to denote a board certified assistant behavior analyst. So if you see the little a, it means assistant behavior analyst, okay? This is one of 4 certification levels that are offered by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or the BACB. There's a lot of different acronyms that we use in behavior analysis, and it can get very confusing. So if you hear me say the BACB, I'm talking about our certification board or our credentialing board. Okay. they offer 4 certification levels. We have the Registered Behavior Technician, we have the Board Certified Assistant Behavior Analyst, we have Board Certified Behavior Analyst, and then Board Certified Behavior Analyst doctoral level. Okay. I'll start with the Registered Behavior Technician. The Registered Behavior Technician requires just a high school degree and a 40-hour completion of a 40-hour course. And there are other requirements to be able to get certified as a Registered Behavior Technician. But it involves taking an exam and getting some supervisory experience as well. Now, this is the one that you all should be focusing on because you're in the ABA track at FIU, which is preparing you, right? Or you're going to complete the courses to sit for the BCABA exam, right? This is the Assistant Behavior Analyst or Board Certified Assistant Behavior Analyst. This is a bachelor's level certification that the BACB offers. And this certification allows you to provide behavior analytic services under the supervision of a board certified behavior analyst. You can do all of the same things that a registered behavior technician does. So you're able to provide direct therapy to clients, but you can also do a lot of the same tasks that a board certified behavior analyst can do, meaning you can supervise, you can provide caregiver training, you can provide staff training. The assistant behavior analyst certification, it's a very well-rounded certification. You can do basically anything that a registered behavior technician can do, and the same things that I shouldn't say everything, but most of the same things that a board certified behavior analyst can do as well. However, you have to do these things under the supervision of a board certified behavior analyst or a doctoral level board certified behavior analyst. So hopefully after the last few slides, you have a better understanding of what the ABA track is at FIU, what the different certification levels offered by the BACB are, and what the board certified assistant behavior analyst certification is. Now, you're going to hear a specific term throughout all of the courses that you take at FIU within the ABA track, and that is the 6th edition BCABA Test Content Outline, or TCO. Okay, the test content outline that you all will be exposed to is the BCABA Test Content Outline, because these are courses that you will be taking that are going to help you to prepare for the BCABA exam. However, the test content outline is something that the Behavior Analyst Certification Board has written up for all the different certification levels. So there's an RBT test content outline, there's a BCABA test content outline, and then there's a shared test content outline for BCBAs and BCBADs. Basically, the different test content outlines just describes all of the content that's going to appear on the exam for that specific certification level. So for the RBT, there's a specific test content outline that tells you exactly what's going to appear on that exam and what areas you as a practitioner should be competent in should you want to sit for the RBT exam. Now, in the case of these courses, we are hoping to prepare you to take the BCABA exam. So we are basing our courses off of the 6th edition BCABA test content outline, because these are the specific content areas that the Behavior Analyst Certification Board has designated as important content for you all to be competent in order to be prepared for the BCABA exam. So that is why throughout this course and hopefully the rest of the courses, you will see us reference the test content outline within most of our lectures. Okay, so we try to tie our content that we are covering, whether it's a lecture or an article, we try to tie everything into the BCABA TCO so that we can ensure that we are adequately covering the material that you all need to be competent in order to pass that exam. I've provided here a link to the test content outline. This is the 6th edition version. Please make sure that when you are looking at the test content outline, you're looking at the 6th edition version, because there are past versions like the 5th edition, but the exam that you all will be taking if you choose to get certified as a BCABA is going to be based off of the 6th edition test content outline. Now, I also want to mention that the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, after every few years, they update the test content outline. So eventually, in a few years, they might put out a 7th edition. But as of January 2025, all of their examinations will be based off of the 6th edition test content outline. And that is why our courses are based off of the 6th edition BCABA test content outline. So this is something that you all want to become familiar with. You want to be able to go through this list of content and self-assess areas that you are doing very well with, areas that you're not so competent in. You want to be able to say, you know what, I'm not so great with positive reinforcement. Let me go and look up material that's going to help me strengthen my understanding of this particular concept or application of this particular concept. So you should be looking at this document fairly frequently and self-assessing your progress with this particular content that is listed in this test content outline. So we're going to get started with our lecture for today. I want to begin by reviewing what is the experimental analysis of behavior, or EAB. The course that you just took, EAB 3002, is a course that focuses exclusively on the experimental analysis, or actually I should say primarily on the experimental analysis of behavior. Within that course, you should have learned that there are different branches of behavior analysis, EAB being the branch that focuses on basic research, primarily conducting experiments in laboratory settings with non-human subjects, and it focuses on identifying those different behavioral principles those different principles that govern behavior. And it forms the scientific foundation for what we know as applied behavior analysis. So the experimental analysis of behavior focuses on the how behavior works in general under very controlled conditions. Whereas in applied behavior analysis, we're taking those behavioral principles that we learned about in the experimental analysis of behavior, and we're learning to now apply them in the real world. Also through controlled experiments, so I'll go over that in a second. But I wanted to make sure that I talk about what the experimental analysis of behavior is, because that realm or that branch of behavior analysis that you covered in the previous course is going to look slightly different than what we are going to cover or focus on in the next few courses and this course within the track. So what is ABA, or what is applied behavior analysis? Again, as I mentioned, applied behavior analysis is taking those principles that we identified as governing behavior within the branch of experimental analysis of behavior, and we're now going to apply those principles to see if we can improve the quality of lives of certain individuals, if we can produce socially significant behavior change. This is done still in a controlled manner, right? There is still experimentation involved within applied behavior analysis. We don't lose that experimental control within applied behavior analysis, but we are focused specifically on socially significant behaviors and improving the quality of life for the individuals and communities that we will be servicing. Everything that we do within applied behavior analysis is going to follow a very scientific or systematic approach, and everything is going to be evidence-based or based on empirical research. So this course is going to differ from EAB 3002, or your course that you just took, which is on the experimental analysis of behavior, in that course focused on basic research and the application of these different principles with non-human subjects. So you probably saw studies with pigeons, with rats, with elephants, and so on. But whereas within this course, we're going to focus on reviewing the applications of behavior analysis in the applied, in an applied way. And so we're going to focus on improving socially significant behaviors across a broad variety of different applications. So within this particular slide, I'm going to briefly cover some of the different applications that you can use ABA within, whether it be different settings or across different populations. But this is a very small set of the different applications that you can use ABA in. So the first one is autism spectrum disorder intervention. So ABA is a widely recognized intervention for individuals with ASD or for autistic individuals. Primarily, this ABA is used for skill acquisition, so we can teach communication, social skills, we can teach daily living skills, and this can be done through a very controlled manner of teaching, where we maybe set up a very controlled environment, we sit at the table and we teach the individual skills, or it can be done through very naturalistic teaching. We embed certain programs naturally into the child's or the individual's day-to-day lives so that they can acquire different skills. We can also focus on behavior reduction across a wide variety of diagnoses. So with autism, with ADHD, with oppositional defiance disorder, we can treat, for example, phobias, addiction, any other types of behavioral issues that may present across different settings. For example, in school, there are certain children that present with behavioral concerns. We can address all of those different issues by assessing what specific behavior the individual is engaging in, and then developing a treatment plan to address that behavior. We can support caregivers, we can support staff. So these are just different forms of application for behavior analysis. And I'm going over this because I think it's important to get a sense for what do we do as behavior analysts, right? Before you start diving into the topics that we're going to cover in the course that are going to get into the nitty gritty of how do we implement certain interventions, right? If you don't have an understanding of the bigger picture of what do we do as behavior analysts, it's going to be hard to be able to understand the topics of, how do we assess behavior, or what do we do at the onset of an intervention, because maybe you don't understand what are we even intervening on. And therefore, I think it's important to see the bigger picture of, well, what can we do as behavior analysts? What do we do? For example, another application of behavior analysis is organizational behavior management, where we can work to enhance workplace efficiency or improve on employee performance. This can be done through providing performance feedback and then making database decisions to improve maybe an employee's performance. So these are, again, just different applications, but it's important for you to kind of visualize what our jobs as behavior analysts might look like, so that you can then dive into the topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is what to do at the onset of ABA services. And I'm not quite sure if I mentioned it earlier, but I want to make sure that I mention it before moving on to the next slide. The application of ABA is so broad. It extends far beyond whatever I've discussed in this slide or what I've included in this slide. Other applications might be, working with individuals that have Alzheimer's to improve their memory. We can work on sports performance, or, I've seen studies on teaching gun safety, on teaching individuals daily living skills like street crossing. So the applications of ABA really extend as far beyond as the different types of behavior that we engage in. Now, the majority of the studies that you might come across within this course or within the research may focus on autism intervention, but that's not the only application of ABA. The main reason why you hear ABA coined as an autism intervention is because that's where the majority of the funding is, but that's not what ABA is. And so I want to make sure that I point that out to you all. ABA extends far beyond intervening, or helping people that are autistic improve their day-to-day lives. That's not what a behavior analyst is restricted to doing. We can work far beyond that particular application. It just so happens that that's where the majority of the funding is, because in all 50 states, there is an autism mandate where insurance funders need to provide therapy for autistic individuals. I think it's in all 50 states. I'm not entirely sure, but I believe in most states there is an autism mandate. And so that's why you hear a lot of individuals that are practicing as RBTs in the field or as BCBAs in the field, they are working primarily with autistic individuals. But that, again, is not the only thing that we do. So let's get started with the discussion on the article that we are covering today, which is by Vetz and Green. They wrote this in 2010, and the article is titled 3 Important Things to Consider When Starting Intervention for a Child Diagnosed with Autism. Again, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, ABA is not just an autism intervention. So although this specific article is geared towards describing how you would intervene or how you would get started when beginning an intervention for a child with autism, I'm making this lecture more general so that it can give you a sense for how we would begin ABA intervention in general, and not just when working with an autistic individual. So when we are reviewing this article today, there are 2 TCO items that we will be focusing on. Number 1 is F1, which says that you should be competent in reviewing relevant information in available records and data at the outset of a case. So when you begin a case, you should be reviewing educational, medical, and historical data. So we'll talk a little bit about that within today's lecture. And then we will also be covering TCO item number 2, which is to identify conditions that warrant behavior analytic services. I would like to get started by giving you a little bit of a background on the authors. They are both employed at the Applied Behavior Analysis Center at St. Mary's Residential Training School in Alexandria, Louisiana. They work with the population of developmental or intellectually disabled individuals. It is a early intervention clinic, and they primarily focus on program development at this clinic. Vetz is a board-certified assistant behavior analyst, or a BCABA, and then Green is his supervisor. So Dr. Green is a BCBAD that is supervising Vetz. So if you've read the article, it is a very short article. I hope that you all read it. You are expected to, and you will be tested on the content within the article. But it's a very good read. And I like it because it highlights the day-to-day process of processes that a behavior analyst may follow. I want to highlight that both of the authors have different certification levels. So the first one is a BCABA, the second one is a BCBAD, as I mentioned previously. And yet they both have the same skill sets, or very similar skill sets, right? The BCBAD obviously is supervising the BCABA, but they are both expected to be able to review records at the onset of a case. They're both expected to be able to evaluate their clients, to be able to determine what their areas of deficit are, what their skill strengths are, what specific problem behaviors they engage in. And so this article provides really good examples of those processes that we as behavior analysts tend to follow at the onset of ABA services. I'm not going to review the specific processes that they follow in the article, because this is specific to their clinic and how they do things at their clinic. And this may differ based off of the population that you're working with. This may differ based off of the assessments that you use. Just even by setting, every single clinic tends to do things very differently. But I thought it was an excellent resource for you all to review, to get a sense for what we do as behavior analysts and what that process of getting started with services might look like for a client and for us as practitioners. So please, if you have not read the article, make sure that you go and read the article, because within this lecture, I will cover the content generally speaking, but I'm not going to sit and walk you through that case study that they've explained in the article. They cover an example of what they would do if they're servicing a client that has skill deficits and they're trying to support them with gaining different skills, versus what they would do if they have a client that engages in problem behavior, and how they would assess those specific problem behaviors and how they would address them moving forward. And they also cover some maintenance plans. So what do you do after you've provided services to the client for a long time and they have benefited from your intervention? How do you make progress from there? Where do you go? Do you update the goals? So I think it's a very, very excellent article for you all to read to introduce you to the topic of behavior analysis and what your role as a BCABA might look like in the future. So in the article, there are 3 key considerations that are highlighted that you should focus on when starting ABA services. The first one is that we should assess resources. The second one is that we need to understand the learner. And the third one is that we need to plan for functional skills. So I'm going to go over what each of these means, and we will talk about certain ways that you can evaluate if you are doing each of these things. In a general way, like I said, every clinic that you work at does things differently. Every client has different needs. And so these are just ways for you to think about how you can get started with ABA services by taking in these different key considerations. Okay, so at the onset of ABA services, there are many key considerations that we must make before we proceed with the client relationship. So the first one that we need to consider is the resources that we have available to us. So you should be assessing your resources, which can involve a myriad of things. These are things such as ensuring we have the availability of trained staff. Are you competent as a supervisor? Things like, do I have the time to service this client? Does the client have the time to dedicate to us? Do we have the necessary materials for intervention, or even an environment that can be supportive of this particular client? So in the next slide, I will show you some questions that you can ask yourselves when you are getting started with the client in order to determine if this is a good client for you to take on or not. So let's get started. The first question you want to ask yourself is, do I have the time and capacity to include this client in my caseload? This might be a very straightforward answer if you do have the time and availability, right? But in other situations, you might have, like an ethical dilemma basically that you're facing, where you have to, let's say, provide 30 hours of billable hours based off of the company that you're working with. Maybe your company tells you you have to work 30 hours with clients this week, but maybe you have 15 clients that you're working with, and you don't have the availability to take on one more client, even though this company is telling you you need to take on one more client. But you know yourself, I'm already struggling to work with these 15 clients that I'm working with, which is a lot, by the way. I'm already struggling with to supervise these 15 clients that I'm working with. I cannot possibly take on another client and adequately provide supervision to them, and caregiver support to the parents or the caregivers that are involved with that case. So there are a lot of considerations that you would want to make in terms of determining whether you have the time and capacity to service that particular client. Some other considerations is, are you in the appropriate mental space to take care of that case, to provide good quality services to that case? Or do you have something going on in your personal life that wouldn't necessarily permit you to provide good quality services, Something else you can think about is maybe all of your current clients are afternoon clients, and this is a client that only has availability in the afternoon, right? So yes, you have time to fill up your caseload to work with other clients, but you only have availability in the morning. And this client only has availability in the afternoon. So that would make this is not a good fit for you, because you may not adequately be able to support the clients that you're already servicing in the afternoon, along with this new client or this new potential client that also requires services in the afternoon. So it's not just a matter of evaluating, do I have time in my schedule, right? But rather evaluating, does my schedule line up with the client's schedule? Am I able to service them in the setting that they need support with, right? Because maybe the client has availability in the afternoons to receive services, but you end up determining that they need services in the school setting, and then you can adequately service them there because you have the availability to service them in the morning. So there are a lot of questions you can ask yourself in terms of, do I have the time and the capacity to include this client into my caseload? It's up to you to make that determination as to whether you will be able to effectively and adequately support that client. The next question is, are funding and financial resources secure and sufficient? Does that client have insurance funding, or will they do private pay? Is there a way for them to get their services covered? Do you have to put in an insurance authorization for that client? Do they have all of the necessary diagnoses or paperwork to get the services that are needed? So there are times when we have a client that comes to us that would like to receive services from us, but unfortunately they're missing certain documentation that the insurance would require in order for us to be able to service them, or even sometimes they don't have the diagnosis that is necessary to be able to provide services to them. Like I mentioned earlier, we as behavior analysts can provide services in a lot of different capacities to different individuals, right? We don't only support individuals with autism, but in many states are mandated to provide services to individuals with autism or autistic individuals. And unfortunately, this is not the case for people with different diagnoses. So people with ADHD, although we can support them, right? We have the skill set to support individuals that are diagnosed with ADHD. Unfortunately, the funding sometimes is just not there, right? The insurances won't cover that service because they're not mandated to provide those services. And it's very unfortunate. And so in a lot of instances, we have clients that come to us seeking service and we have to turn them away unless they're able to, secure funding in another way, whether it be through a nonprofit or they can afford, private pay services, which is very expensive. And in a lot of cases, most families can't afford that. And so their children end up going without services. But anyways, one question that you would need to ask yourself is, are the funding and the financial resources secure and sufficient? Do they have the necessary paperwork or the necessary documentation to get services? Can I get them an insurance authorization, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so all of those things are things you would want to ask yourself. The next point is the treatment setting safe and conducive to effective services? This is a I would argue that all of these are very important, but this one in particular is very important. You have to self-assess as a practitioner, do I have the necessary space to support this individual? Can I keep this individual safe in this particular setting that I will be servicing them in? For example, let's say that I would like to service a client that engages in elopement. Elopement, by the way, is when an individual runs away. Like they'll be standing next to you and then they just leave the space. All of a sudden they run away. Whether it be they leave the room or they leave the building in some cases. So if you know that you will be supporting a client that engages in elopement, you have to ask yourself, do I have a setting that would be conducive to supporting this individual? Do I have the staff to be able to support an individual that engages in elopement? Because typically when a child engages in elopement, you have to have an emergency plan in place, meaning that at any given point when that child elopes, you have to have staff that can run after them and can keep them safe if that's part of the plan, if that's part of the treatment plan, right? To have staff grab that child before they leave the room or before they leave the building, then you would need to make sure that you have enough support staff to be able to provide that effective service to that client. Some other cases to consider are, for example, if you have a child that engages in a severe form of problem behavior, such as property destruction. Do you have a setting that can adequately support that individual, right? Do you have like an empty room or a room with little to no furniture where you can provide services and keep that individual safe? Do you have a padded room? There are some clinics that have padded rooms. Most do not, but some do. And if you don't have that type of room, are you able to set it up, and are you able to set that up for the client? So the next question you want to ask yourself is, do I have the necessary materials, tools, and team support for implementation? So for example, if your answer to the previous question was no, I don't have a treatment setting that is safe, then the next question you should ask yourself is, am I able to modify my treatment setting in order to provide a safe environment for that individual? That might involve getting additional materials like pads for a padded room, right? Are you able to provide that safe environment for that individual? If the answer is no, then you should not service that client, and you should likely refer that client out to somebody that can adequately support that individual. Okay, do you have the team support to be able to implement an intervention that sometimes we have very complex interventions. Sometimes our interventions are very simple, and one practitioner can carry out the intervention. But there are times when we service clients that engage in such severe forms of problem behavior where they require 2 RBTs at once. Or we have clients that we service sometimes that don't even require an RBT level certificate, right? Because they might have they might require a person with more expertise, like a board certified behavior analyst. It's not common for board certified behavior analysts to provide direct services. We have some behavior analysts that decide to provide direct services, but in a lot of cases, we have the RBTs as direct providers and the behavior analysts as supervisors. But there are situations that warrant board certified behavior analysts to service clients rather than registered behavior technicians. And it sometimes is because the problem behavior is so severe. So you need to ask yourselves, do I have the materials, the tools, or the team support for implementation? And if I don't, can I set it up for this client? Or is it better and more ethical for me to just refer this client out? Okay, so the next question that you want to ask yourselves is, can I supervise and train the team members effectively? Okay, and by the team members, this could be the RBTs or a therapist that is on staff that will be supporting that particular client. You need to make sure that you as a supervisor have the time to provide support to that individual on a consistent basis. And a consistent basis typically will look like on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. Okay, RBTs should be getting minimally support on a monthly basis. However, if you want to be providing good quality ABA services, you should be supervising that staff member at the very least on a weekly or bi-weekly basis with every single client that they service. And I want to emphasize this point of that you should be able to provide support to them with every client that they service, because every client's needs are so different. So just because you are supervising Sally, right? Let's say Sally is the RBT and Sally works with Bobby and Julia, okay? Let's say that you only have time to supervise Sally with Bobby. That's not okay, because Julia is one of your clients and she should be receiving support too. She should be receiving ongoing program modification, and Sally may not know how to work with Julia. Sally may be wonderful as a practitioner when she works with Bob, but maybe Julia presents different skill deficits that Sally's not well versed in. And so you as the board certified assistant behavior analyst should be sure to provide support to your therapist with every single client that they're servicing. And I also want to emphasize another point. This is more of like something I've been noticing in the field. I've noticed that sometimes we have therapists that are very well seasoned or very well experienced. They've been working in the field for years and they work very well with clients, right? They have maybe worked with 50 clients, 20 clients, who knows, however many clients they've worked with across the years. But I want to highlight a point. Every single client that you work with is a brand new client and is a completely different individual with individual needs. This means that just because Sally works very well with Bob doesn't mean that she's going to work very well with Julia. You as the BCABA, or in the future possibly a BCBA, should be providing supervision and training with every single client that RBT works with. And just because they're more experienced does not mean that they require less supervision or support. Okay, so don't assume that just because a therapist has more experience, they require less support. You can have a different dynamic with them. You can support them in different ways, supervise them in different ways, right? It can be a more collaborative approach, but you should still be supervising all of your RBTs with every single client that they work with. Next, you should be assessing whether there are barriers that require additional resources to address. This is important. It's very important to address barriers at the start of an intervention because, well, actually, I'm gonna try to define what a barrier is for you. A barrier is basically something that is in place that will make the intervention very difficult, or will make it difficult for you to achieve the effects of the intervention that you would like to see. Okay, so sometimes this could be something like language. There's a language barrier, which is very it's a major barrier, right? If you have a practitioner that only speaks English and the family, only speaks another language, it can be difficult to communicate with that family. So you should be putting in measures into place that will support that family so that you can basically bridge the gap with the language barrier, whether it be providing a translator or having staff on that works with that client that has a similar cultural background as that client, or that speaks the same language as that client. There are sometimes also additional barriers, such as a client that will engage in problem behavior in school, but the school does not permit you to provide services. And so those are also barriers that we need to try to address before we get started with services, because we need to determine, well, how can I support this client in the school setting if the school doesn't permit me to go in, right? So what are other ways that I can support that that child, or that client, whether it be maybe providing training to the teacher via Zoom, or offering to provide staff training to the counselor. So there are different ways that we can support individuals that are not traditional, but we have to try to find ways to overcome these barriers that are in place. If we're not able to overcome these barriers, for example, if you have a parent that is seeking support in a school setting for an individual, and the school is saying, no, we don't want any services, any ABA services, and the parent is unwilling, maybe the teacher is unwilling to receive training from you. The school staff is unwilling to receive any support from you. There's no way for you to service that client adequately in that setting. And so the next step would possibly be suggesting to the parent maybe to switch settings, or to find another setting where you can service that client and support them with those behaviors. And if that's not a possibility, then you have to say, I don't think that this is a good fit. I won't be able to adequately support this client and help improve their behaviors in the school setting if that's the only place where they engage in the behaviors and they're not allowing us in. So there are sometimes barriers where you really cannot provide intervention because they just don't permit you to see that behavior in the setting that you need to see it in. Maybe that's the only setting that the behavior engages, that the child engages in the behavior. And so we just can't service those clients. But there are many other barriers that we can work around and we can try to mitigate in order to appropriately service that client. Another barrier is sometimes the caregivers don't have the availability to do caregiver training. So we have to work around their schedules to provide support to them in some ways. And that's something that you'll talk about at another time, but this is just a general idea. You need to make sure that if there are barriers in place, you should be assessing, are there ways to mitigate these barriers? Okay, so the next question you should be asking yourself says, do I possess the skills and the knowledge to meet the specific needs of this client? This basically means that you should be self-assessing whether you are competent in the areas that child needs support, or that client needs support. Are you able to adequately service that client or not? And just as an example, I, for example, have only ever worked with one client that had Alzheimer's disease, and this was as a research assistant. I was under the supervision guidance of another board-certified behavior analyst. She was conducting research on the application of, I can't recall what particular intervention, but it was an ABA intervention to see if we can improve some Alzheimer's symptoms. And so I only worked with that client because I was under the guidance of another BCBA that was well-versed in interventions working with this particular population of individuals with Alzheimer's. Had I not been working with that particular behavior analyst and under the supervision of that behavior analyst, it would have been inappropriate for me to service that client. Now, if someone approaches me and asks me, Sarah, you have provided services to someone with Alzheimer's. Would you like to service someone else with Alzheimer's? I would say no, because I am not competent in that area. It is not my area of expertise. Although I've worked with one client that had Alzheimer's, it was for a very short period of time, and I am not well versed in the literature or in the interventions that would be effective for that intervention. And the interventions that would be effective for those clients that have that particular diagnosis. So we need to be able to self-assess whether we possess the skills and the knowledge to be able to support our specific clients. You don't have to be an expert. If you're not an expert, that's okay. But are you able to adequately service that client? And if you're not, then you should be seeking out supervision and training to be able to service that particular client, should you take that client on. Okay. If you're not going to take the client on, then that's okay. Refer them out to somebody that is an expert in that particular area. But if you will be servicing that client, then you need to make sure that either you're very adequately trained in that area, or that you seek out supervision and guidance so that you can gain the skills to be able to give good quality service to that client. You'll cover a little bit more about this within your ethics course. They'll cover, you working within your scope of competence, but this is a general question that you should be asking yourself at the onset of services. Do I have the skills to be able to service this client, or do I not? If I don't, then how can I gain supervision or support to be able to service this individual if I choose to service them? Okay. The second to last question that you should be asking yourself, and again, this is just a sample of questions. There could be many more questions that you might want to ask yourselves, but this is just a series of questions that I came up with that I thought would be good to self-evaluate whether you should be servicing that client or not. So the second to last question that I have here on this slide says, can I meet the intensity of the services required? So, earlier we talked about whether you have the time and capacity to service that client, but this question is slightly different. This question says, can I meet the intensity of the services required? Sometimes there are clients that require, let's say, 20 or 30 hours a week of intervention. I've heard as much as 40 hours a week of intervention. If you want to adequately support a client that receives 20 hours a week of intervention, you should be supervising them for 2 hours a week at least. So imagine a client that receives 40 hours a week of intervention. Can you dedicate 4 hours a week of supervision to them? Additionally, if you recommend that a client receives 20 hours of services, do you have the staff to provide, those 20 hours of intervention? Right? Are you able to meet that intensity? So it's not just about you as a supervisor. Yes, you have to evaluate whether you as a supervisor can provide, the supervision to the intensity that's required. Typically, the standard is, the minimum requirement is 5%, usually for if you're supervising an RBT. I would say you should minimally be supervising a client 10% of their hours that they receive. I personally always try to supervise at least 20% of the hours of direct therapy that they receive. So if a child is receiving 20 hours of direct therapy, then I try to supervise 4 hours. I usually request 20% supervision. That's correct. Yeah. So I usually do request 20% supervision, and I do my best to try to provide 20% supervision in order to be able to adequately support that client. So going back to the question, you want to ask yourself, can you meet the intensity of the services that are required? Okay, so are you able to put enough staff with that client, and are you able to provide supervision at the intensity that's required for that particular client? And then the final question is, are caregiver or support networks willing and able to participate? This isn't going to make or break your intervention. There are situations where we only provide exclusively caregiver training and we don't provide any direct intervention to the client. This is typically when clients have very low need. We will exclusively focus on parent or caregiver training. So in those situations, if a caregiver is unable to participate, then you might want to say, I don't think this is a good fit. I won't be able to support you guys if you're not able to, participate in the intervention. However, for most cases, you're able to at least get some support from caregivers, and it's very difficult at the beginning of a service to determine how that caregiver will be throughout your time servicing that client. But usually you're able to do some things to motivate that caregiver to participate in your sessions. Maybe not at the intensity that you would like, but in some capacity, you're able to get them to participate in caregiver training sessions. So yes, at the beginning of, or at the onset of services, you want to evaluate how willing those caregivers are to participate in the intervention. But it's not going to make or break the intervention. Actually, One thing that can make or break the intervention is if you're providing an intervention in a school setting and you don't have the support of the teachers. That can be very challenging because you're working in a setting where you want to be able to eventually fade yourself out. You want to be able to eventually put supports in place for that client to be supported by, the teacher itself. But if the teacher is unwilling to participate with your intervention, then what's the end goal, right? Like, how do you get out? How do you support that client and fade yourself out if the person that you're supposed to be fading control to is not interested in participating in your intervention? So these are all things that you want to ask yourselves to help you determine, is this client a good fit for me or is this client not a good fit? So now that we've covered how to assess resources and just general questions that you can ask yourself, I want you to go ahead and answer this question. So what are some important considerations when starting ABA services? This is a select all that apply question. So please, if you see that there are multiple choices that are correct, go ahead and select the different choices that you feel are correct. So the next key consideration that you want to take into account when getting started with ABA services is that you should try to understand the learner. So at this point, you've already decided that you would like to proceed with this client, right? You felt that it was a good fit and you can adequately support them. And so you want to get to know the learner. This means that you want to conduct thorough assessments to determine this individual's particular needs. What are their strengths? What are their skill deficits? What are the areas where they require support? Okay, so in the next slide, I'll show you some questions that you can ask yourself to basically guide the process of getting to know the learner. I do want to mention that this is like a much more extensive process. You're going to have an entire course dedicated to assessment and intervention. Or just assessment, I'm sorry. But this is basically an introduction to what that would look like. On this slide, I've put together a series of questions that you can ask yourself in order to get a better understanding of the learner. They serve as a guide, and there may be other questions that you want to consider or other items that you would like to consider, but this is just a way to potentially guide that process. And again, as I mentioned, the assessment process is a very complex process, and you'll have an entire course dedicated to this. This is just to give you a general overview because this will set the tone for the rest of the course and to get a better understanding of how we service our clients. So understanding the learner is very important. And one of the first things that we can do is review the records that are already available to us. So this could be something as simple as medical records, records from previous therapy. So an example would be if you have a client or a potential client that has received an assessment by a neurologist, or a psychiatrist or whoever it may be, whatever other profession it might be, maybe a speech therapist, you can request those records from the caregivers. And you should be doing your due diligence and reviewing all of those documents to get a better sense for the client's needs, what interventions have already been attempted, Are there any medical conditions? There's something called comorbidity. So oftentimes we work with clients that are not just diagnosed with one condition, but they have other conditions that we should be aware of because they may impact, the way that we want to implement our interventions. Our interventions may not be as effective if they have other concerns that you're not taking into account. So you definitely want to do a medical records review. You need to review any previous assessments that they've had done, maybe at other agencies, with other therapies. If you're able to, you can request meetings to collaborate with other professionals. I've had meetings at the onset of services where I have a client that was transitioning from another ABA agency, and we've requested meetings with those behavior analysts to get a sense for the interventions that they've attempted, what has been effective, what has not been effective. We can ask questions about any barriers to intervention, things like that. And I also have when we've transitioned clients from our company to other companies, we have had those BCBAs reach out and request, like a transition meeting. So all of this kind of falls into that portion of getting to know that learner. How can I better support them? What are their needs? And then we can move into a more in-depth analysis of what that client's needs are. Okay, so that's it. You've done records review. Well, now what else can we analyze to understand the learner a little bit better? So some of those things that you can review are what are their physical or sensory issues that may contribute to some of their behaviors that they're engaging in? Are there any particular needs that client has that would help your intervention if you were to address some of those of those concerns? Would they be able to help you with your intervention? Are there any environmental or contextual variables that impact the learner's behavior or development? So this means, for example, what does the setting that you are looking to intervene in, what does that setting look like? Is it set up for providing therapy? Are there any siblings that will be present while you're providing therapy, or any other individuals that will be present when you're providing therapy that could influence the potential intervention? So there are some clients that I've worked with that we provide services in home with them, and their siblings are at home. And so we have to consider ways to integrate their siblings into the session. Maybe not the entire session, but we do find ways to integrate their siblings into the session, because that's an important part of their day-to-day lives. They're interacting with this individual, and we should teach them to socialize, etc. So this is just like one of those you want to basically conduct an analysis of what does their environment look like? How can I input supports into their environment? What variables should I consider about that, the context within which they will be receiving therapy? Because all of these things will impact the session. You want to consider the caregivers and what are they able to do? I've had, for example, clients that are at home with their grandparents, and their grandparents are very old. And if I'm attempting to, not just old, right, but some might have physical mobility issues. And so if I'm attempting to implement an intervention and that caregiver can't follow through with that intervention because I didn't consider their mobility concerns, then that will impact my intervention that I am putting together for that learner. So those are all environmental or contextual variables that I need to consider, because they will impact the effectiveness of the intervention that I put into place. So now that we've considered all of those environmental factors, I've reviewed the medical records, and I have a better sense for, what that client's history looks like. I can now dive into assessing the client and getting to know what their needs are right now. So I'll conduct a thorough assessment to get a sense for what their areas of skill deficit are, what their strengths are, and where I can provide support for that particular client. There are a ton of different assessments that we can conduct, and the assessment that you choose will vary depending on the client that you're working with. This is, again, one of those more complex topics that you'll cover in a future course. But it's important that you know that this is a step or a phase within understanding the learner. Okay, so once you've conducted these assessments, you should have a better sense for what that client's needs are, where you can support them. You'll also have a sense for what the barriers to intervention are. I mentioned the barriers to intervention earlier in this lecture. So once we do the assessment process, we can typically get a better sense for what those barriers are, and we typically try to address those barriers before we move on to focusing on skill acquisition and whatnot. So the next question says, have I evaluated the individual's communication abilities and their needs? So typically when we conduct an assessment, that the assessments tend to include a communication component. These assessments that we conduct can be focused on exclusively communication. We have problem behavior assessments, and then we have some more broad assessments that will evaluate individuals on a global basis to get a sense for what their social skills deficits are, what their communication deficits are, their daily living skills deficits, and also their areas of strength as well. You want to ask yourself what motivates the learner, and have I conducted preference or reinforcer assessments? We need to make sure that we understand what gets the client going, right? Like what can we modify in our environment to make the client motivated to communicate more effectively, or to want to participate in our sessions and in our programs. We don't want our interventions to be negative or like a negative experience for that client that we're working with. On the contrary, we want to make sure that we have an enriched environment, that we include things that are preferred to that client, that are likely to reinforce their behaviors. And so the only way to know what functions as a reinforcer is to conduct assessments. And those are different types of assessments that we as behavior analysts conduct, called preference assessments and reinforcer assessments. So you don't know what those are necessarily right now. You'll learn about those, but it's important to know that this is a part of the process to understanding learners and being able to service them most effectively. The next one says, are the identified target behaviors measurable, observable, and meaningful to the learner? So when you go through your assessment process, you will, like I mentioned, identify areas of strength, skill deficits, problem behaviors, areas of need. When we do that entire process, we typically will write up a program for that client that we are working with, and we'll develop a plan of intervention. When we are writing up that program or that intervention plan, we want to make sure that we are defining behaviors in an objective manner, in a measurable and observable and meaningful way for that client. So that's one way that we can make sure that we are understanding the learner and that we are tailoring our intervention to their individual and particular needs. Which leads me to the next point. How can I tailor my approach to account for the learner's unique needs and cultural background? We do this. This can be done in a variety of ways, but this is an important consideration as well when trying to understand the learner. We want to make sure in behavior analysis that every single one of our interventions is tailored individually to that particular client. And so every single one of these questions, if you go through these, okay, and you make sure that you are being thorough and that you are not just doing cookie cutter, like a cookie cutter process for everybody, right? You should not, what you do for each client should not look exactly the same. Every single client should have a completely different process, or it could be mostly similar and vary based off of that client's individual need. Like I mentioned earlier, something as simple as conducting a different assessment that will meet that client's need will help you to tailor that intervention for that client's unique abilities, okay? To simply say, you know what, for every client that comes into this clinic, I'm going to conduct this one assessment, that is not correct, because that might not be what everybody needs. So there are a variety of ways that we can tailor our approach to each individual client. But one simple way is to make sure that we are answering every single one of these questions and being considerate of that individual client's needs. If you are answering these questions and basically having these questions guide the process, then your intervention will look distinctly different for what each learner needs. Is the client's support system aware of and aligned with the treatment goals is the final question that I have on this slide. Again, there are tons of questions that you can ask yourself to help you understand a learner better. It's just part of the process. But this question, is the client support system aware of and aligned with the treatment goals, is important because it will get your caregivers on board. Their teachers on board with the intervention, right? If you're not sharing your treatment plan with teachers, with the other therapists that may be working with that client, let's say that they see a speech therapist or an occupational therapist, if they don't know what you're working on and they don't necessarily agree or you don't work on collaborating with all of those individuals, your intervention will be much less effective. And so to best support your client, we have to make sure that we are incorporating their support system and that we have basically gotten not necessarily consent from every single one of those individuals. You need to get consent from the client and from their caregivers, but there may be parts of, like for example, a teacher doesn't necessarily need to consent to an intervention, but you can share your intervention with them and collaborate on goals with them to help support that client. So this leads us to our next ASR question. This is a short answer question, so please make sure that you are writing out a response to this question. It says, what is the primary goal of reviewing records at the outset of ABA services? There could be a few goals. A few reasons why you would review records. Please just write one of those reasons. Don't leave your question blank. You will get no credit for leaving the question blank. Make sure that you are responding. For the next question, we have a true or false question. It says, when servicing a client, I don't need to consider their individual cultural needs and values. Please go ahead and respond. Okay, now we will continue our discussion on the key considerations when starting ABA services. So we've gone over the importance of assessing resources, understanding the learner, and now we will talk a little bit about the importance of planning for functional skills. This means that you want to select intervention goals that are meaningful for that client, that are going to improve their quality of life, and that will be functional for them in that particular environment that they are in. Earlier, we discussed ways to assess resources, and we also discussed ways to better understand your learner and their particular needs. Those different phases of the onset of ABA services, I think help prepare you for this phase of planning for functional skills. You have to do a really good job with the assessment process to be able to best understand your learner and create goals that are meaningful to that particular learner and that will improve the quality of their life. If you don't know, if you don't have a good understanding of your learner, it'll be very difficult to find those skills that are meaningful to that learner and that will help them, access more reinforcers in their environment, acquire skills more quickly, etc. So this series of questions just helps enhance some of what you should have already done within your assessment process that helped you to better understand your learner. These series of questions will help make sure that you are on the right path to creating functional skills for your client. So the first question says, are the intervention goals aligned with the individual's current needs and long-term aspirations? When you are working with a client, it is, depending on the client's skill level, it is perfectly okay to incorporate them into your intervention and ask them, what's important to you? What would you like to be doing in 5 months, in 6 months? What skills would you like to learn? Actually, you'll have probably more success with your intervention when you tailor your intervention to their particular preferences, to things that are important to them. Let's say that there's a client that values sewing, that would love to learn sewing. You could teach skills that they need to learn. Like, for example, maybe they need to learn to follow instructions, to be able to put things together. Maybe they need to learn imitation skills. There are ways that you can incorporate their own preferences into those particular goals. So for example, for following instructions, you can incorporate following instructions within an activity that they like, a hobby that they would like to learn, like sewing. You could have them learn to imitate individuals through video modeling on a computer, where they are learning to copy what they are seeing on that video. So the general idea here is to ask yourself, am I creating goals that are aligned with that client's preferences, that are important to that client, that will help them reach their long-term goals? It's important to, determine what that client needs developmentally, but also, what's important to them. And sometimes just simply asking them, like, what would you like to work on is going to help you achieve this goal. Again, that may not always be possible with every single client that you're working with. The next one says, have I considered the individual's preferences, interests, and cultural values when selecting goals? I kind of touched on this already. So you can incorporate the individual's preferences or interests very easily when developing goals. You can make things fun for them. Our interventions are not meant to be like, I don't know, boring or difficult for the individual. You can learn within things that you like or that you enjoy doing. And so we should explore ways to incorporate our clients' individual preferences and interests. And then the last one is very important. So are we finding ways to incorporate what's culturally important to that client? And maybe it's not the client, maybe it's their parent. An example that I recently heard from a BCBA that I work with in Guatemala, for some of their families over there, culturally, it's important for kids to learn to break a piñata. And, maybe that's not important here and you wouldn't see it as a meaningful skill here, but breaking a piñata over there means that you can participate in social events. Every single birthday involves breaking a piñata. And so for some of their clients, they had a particular mom that when they interviewed her and they asked her what's important to you, she said, I would just like my son to learn to break a piñata, because every time we go to a social event, he wants to and he would like to, but he's not able to. And that just, maybe for us culturally here in the United States, you would say that's not an important skill. That's not an important functional skill. That's not going to improve the quality of this kid's life, because that's not a common tradition here, in the United States. But over there in Guatemala, where it is very common for children to break piñatas in parties, it can open up the social that client's social repertoire. It'll open up their environment to new reinforcers. So for them, that is important and that is valuable. There are many other ways that you can incorporate cultural values into like a client's programming. You can ask the parent, are pleasantries important for you? Are they important in your culture? Is it important for a client to say please and thank you? For some people don't mind, but in some cultures, it's very rude and disrespectful, and they won't get access to reinforcers in their environment. And so we have to consider what is important to that family and their needs. And you'll learn a lot more about this. In this introductory lecture, you're not gonna get exposure to everything that you can learn about this particular topic, or about any of these topics really. This just serves as an introduction to get a sense for what does that initial process of getting started with services look like. You can also ask yourself, are the selected goals socially valid? Are they important to that individual? Are they going to help that individual access new reinforcers? And do they reflect what is important to the individual in their support network? I just mentioned that already earlier. Am I ensuring that the selected goals are appropriate for the individual's developmental stage and their learning capacity? This is incredibly important, just as all of these other things are. But there are times where, for example, I've worked with a client and the client is, let's say, 13 years old, but she really likes Barbies. Developmentally, she's like maybe a 4 or 5-year-old, and the caregiver may request for her to stop playing with Barbies because it doesn't seem age appropriate. Well, we have to, help guide sometimes our caregivers to be more understanding of developmental age and developmental stages. We may have adults that we work with that still like Elmo, and they may not ever reach age appropriateness. So we have to be considerate of what's developmentally appropriate for that particular client. We shouldn't incorporate, our own biases as to what is appropriate or not appropriate. And we also need to kind of support caregivers with being more accepting of particular needs that their child has. So this other question goes hand in hand with the one earlier. It says, are the goals measurable? Are they achievable and appropriate for the individual's current skill level? We want to just, guide our intervention based off of where a person is at now and not necessarily where they should be. right? We want to meet a client where they are at now, and then we can work up from there on a step-by-step process. The next question says, do the goals promote independence and participation in daily activities? I mentioned this earlier. We just want to make sure that our goals are going to help our clients access more reinforcers in their environment, that it's going to help them to be more independent in their environment. When we can select goals that will make it more accessible for them to be independent, to be able to do things on their own, then that's much better than selecting sometimes more quote unquote meaningless goals that won't help them to improve their quality of their life in any way. In my experience, we will have caregivers that we have all kinds of caregivers, but I've worked with some caregivers that can nitpick every single little thing that they would like their child to learn. They're able to pinpoint every single thing, and it's our job as behavior analysts to help guide where the intervention goes. So we should be able to assess, which one of these will help that client gain more independence and more liberty within their day-to-day lives, which one will help them learn new skills, which one will help them acquire more reinforcers, be able to interact with more individuals, et cetera, et cetera. There are sometimes goals that some people might suggest, whether it's a caregiver or a teacher, that might not be as impactful in an individual's life. It's not that it's not important. We can eventually work on those, but if there are bigger, more overarching goals that will help that client access more independence, then we should focus on those and prioritize those. And then we can revisit, once they've mastered some goals, we can revisit some of those smaller goals that might not be as impactful on that individual's life. The next question says, will achieving these goals enhance the individual's quality of life, relationships, or access to meaningful experiences? I covered that earlier. I got a little bit ahead of myself. I also talked about making sure that we prioritize goals, just as this question here asks, and then incorporating functional skills that are likely to generalize across environments and settings is very important. So when we are developing interventions, we want to make sure that we're developing interventions that can have lasting change, that will produce lasting change. So this means that we shouldn't only intervene on a behavior in one particular setting. We want to make sure that that individual can engage in that behavior in other settings with different people, not just with us in the one setting that we're working with them in. So we want to make sure that we are planning for generalization and that we are also planning for maintenance. We want these different skills that we're teaching them to maintain. So you need to make sure that you are asking yourselves, when you're planning for functional skills, are there ways that I can help this behavior generalize to other settings, to different people? Should I train other people? What will I do once the behavior is mastered to make sure that this behavior stays within that client's repertoire? And then lastly, will the intervention lead to the acquisition of meaningful skills rather than just the elimination of problem behaviors? When we are working with clients, we want to make sure, let's say that you have a client that engaged in the problem behavior. Sure, we want to make sure we reduce their behavior, but is there another behavior that I can teach in its place so that that client can still access that reinforcer that they were seeking initially? So to have the most effective intervention when we are reducing a behavior, we should try to find a replacement behavior that we can increase instead. So next we have a short answer question, which says, describe one consideration that you should make when planning for functional skills. This can be anything that we've covered in the previous slide. Just please go ahead and select one consideration that you should make. So these last two slides serve as a review for what we've covered so far within this lecture. So in your initial evaluations for intervention, we want to make sure that we are reviewing all diagnostic, developmental, and psychoeducational assessments. You want to make sure that you are conducting observations and using standardized tools to determine the skill deficits and strengths for each individual client, as well as problematic behavior or maladaptive behavior that they may engage in. And then you also want to make sure that you are identifying those functional and meaningful goals based on behavioral cusps that lead to future skill development. And we'll talk about what behavioral cusps are in another lecture. But it's basically ways to certain behaviors that you can teach that will allow that individual to access new reinforcers, new environments, etc. You'll learn a lot more about this in the future. And then finally, these are some ethical considerations that you should make when getting started with ABA services. You should ensure that interventions are evidence-based and that they are tailored to your client's individual needs and their preferences. You want to make sure that you are providing supervision and training for your team members. So you want to set up in that initial onset of services, you want to, again, assess what your resources are. So are you able to provide that quality of service that that client requires? Are you able to provide enough supervision to your staff? Things like that. And then you want to regularly review progress and adapt interventions based on data. So these different components that are covered in this slide are all different topics that you're going to learn a lot more extensively on in the next few courses. Within this course, we will learn about different interventions and things like that. And then in the next few courses, you'll also learn more about ethics, about how to monitor progress and whatnot. But this entire lecture should give you a general overview for what the ABA process what the process of getting started with services looks like, and then some considerations that you should take. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.